BRICS. I want to talk about this because, Peter, we've got that meeting's coming up soon, and a lot of my followers had questions. What does this mean? What is a BRIC? What is gold-backed currency? What does any of this mean? And I know there's a lot of open questions about it, but I'd like to talk about it because it feels seismic to me.
Yeah, so BRICS is a collection of countries that are trying to find an alternative to what they see as the hegemonic dollar-based US-run global economy. So BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And now there's something like 30 countries, 30 or 40 countries that are interested in joining this grouping. And probably if you had to identify a single country, it's China that's really leading it. And China is very interested in setting up an alternative sort of world hegemon to the US. So they don't necessarily want to play by the US rules. They don't want to be, from their perspective, bullied by the US. And a big shift in interest towards escaping the dollar for a lot of these countries was what happened to Russia when Putin invaded Ukraine. So for decades, ever since the dollar kind of took over in 1945, it had been sort of understood that even if countries don't like each other, you keep the dollar out of it. You keep the monetary system out of it. So, you know, the logic being that you want your enemies to be dependent on you as well. And so during the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union had many wars going on all over the world. Many of these were hot. You know, of course, Vietnam and Korea were tragedies. And even then, we did not go after the dollar. But what happened in the wake of the Ukraine invasion is that the US seized Russia's sovereign dollars. And that was about 300 billion worth, which in perspective, right, relative to the size of the Russian economy, that would be something like 4 trillion in our terms. All right, so that was an enormous percent of Russia's national wealth. And it was seized presumably to try to set off a banking crisis. Now, ironically enough, for separate reasons, our banks crashed. But anyway, that didn't work. But the problem, the problem is that every country on earth saw that happen. All right, you've got now all these countries that they were never really hostile to the US, but they're starting to wonder now, could they come after me? Could they try to crash my banks? You know, from these countries' perspectives, if the US manages to crash your banks, then that could lead to massive civil unrest. You could have civil war. They could end up like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya getting shivved in a street, right? So this is an existential fear for these countries. And I mean, indeed, leaders have been coming out. The president of Indonesia, he was speaking at a group of Southeast Asian countries, and he literally said, we have to, you know, get out from under the dollar because look what happened to Russia. All right. So those sanctions really accelerated the talk. And so now BRICS had been sort of flirting with a dollar alternative for a long time. But at this point now it's accelerating. And so they've got a meeting coming up in August. And one of the items that may or may not be on the agenda is the prospect of a gold-backed BRICS currency. The Russian embassy in Kenya originally announced it, which is kind of a goofy way to announce things. And so
it's a little weird.
You might expect it to come from the Kremlin. But anyway, you know, they first kind of got the ball rolling. Both China and Russia had been flirting about gold backing for a long time. And so, you know, this didn't really shock anybody. South Africa is now saying, no, it's not on the agenda. And so it's an open question. But if you sort of zoom out, what I think is interesting is that if any country did gold back a widely used currency, that would, I mean, it would be catastrophic for the US dollar, right? That would give the world an alternative sort of payment rail that is even stronger than the dollar is today. Now, the way it would be structured, most likely, and, you know, again, we don't have details yet. We may get some out of this next meeting. I think the most likely way that it's structured is not that they would gold back their own currency, right? Like they wouldn't gold back the ruble or the Chinese yuan. Instead, they would create a new trade currency, like a separate currency. And they would use that for trade initially between the BRICS countries. That might be Would they gold back? And if they do, then that would be a stronger, right? It would hold its value better than the US dollar. And so that might lure other countries into it to use it for trade. Now, if you're using a currency for trade, you automatically start using it for financial flows as well, because the transaction costs are much lower. And so if that were to happen, now there's a lot of ifs there, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying this is extremely likely to happen next Tuesday, but if that were to happen, then that could start draining enormous amounts away from the US dollar. That would make the US dollar weaker. It would make inflation here much higher. You know, if we sort of extend to what's possible, again, not what's likely, but what's possible, we can look back to the 1997 financial crisis in Asia, and there you had currencies drop by like half or more.
Right. Right. So let me go rewind. So it was February 28th, 2022 when the United States froze Russia's sovereign dollar reserves, which proved they were neither sovereign nor reserves. This was the dollar's been used as a club.
Exactly.
Right. But this time it was weaponized. That was a really great point you made, that's actually that makes sense, that this was an attempt to completely destabilize the financial system of a country, which is as bad as anything that could happen, because that really will destroy an entire country, lickety split. So seeing that, it can only make sense for countries to conclude, kind of like North Korea concluded, maybe I should have a nuclear bomb. You know, there's a certain, conclusion you can come to, which is like, I should be not totally vulnerable to that, right? So it seems like that's what these countries have really concluded. But it's been many decades in the making, it seems. But that rush, I was surprised. You mentioned 30 countries are sort of raised their hands and said, can we join this new club?
Yeah. And, these are countries that have long been traditional U.S. allies. So Mexico has expressed an interest, Saudi Arabia, which is the linchpin of the petrodollar system. These are not like Yemen or Syria or something, right? These are sort of legitimate countries that have long been in the U.S. orbit. And I think you made a great point comparing it to North Korea's nukes. There's a certain, you don't want to make your enemies feel so insecure that they are going to go with the nuclear option, right? Either if you've decided that they are your enemies, then you must crush them, okay? But if you don't plan on crushing them, then you kind of got to find a way to live together, because otherwise that's exactly what they do. They start reaching for the nuclear buttons, and financially, the nuclear option is a gold-backed currency. Now, it would be fantastic for humanity in that sense, right? I mean, I would love nothing more than to have some viable gold-backed common use currency. But in terms of the US dollar, or in terms of America's ability to project power around the world, a gold-backed currency, right? If the US keeps pushing these countries, that would be the nuclear solution. And, in fact, this administration across the board, it has really made foreign policy secondary to domestic politics. So whether it's green policy, whether it's social policies having to do with the family, it's put a lot of pressure on countries, including Japan, a longtime ally. They're having a debate right now about social policy. I'm not sure if I can say exactly what that is. And at any rate, the U.S. is intervening, and there have been a lot of complaints in Japan about sort of intervention in domestic policy. Traditionally, the U.S. had a very grown-up approach to foreign policy, which is that you guys do whatever it is you do. Right. If you have conservative electorate and, they've got issues with social policy, you do it the way you will. But now this administration in particular has really moved that to where these countries may feel like every last issue, including how they do their schools, how they do family policy, they may feel like all of those things could also potentially be grounds for the U.S. to come in and start trying to crash their economy. It's exactly what happened with Uganda. They had a relatively conservative social law that came in, and the Biden administration started hinting at, reviewing their duty-free access to the U.S. market, at, financial or trade sanctions against Uganda over social policy, right? So it's one thing if a country knows that the rules are you're not supposed to invade your neighbor. Most countries aren't interested in doing that. But on the other hand, if now a country has to worry, they have to keep tabs on every activist who goes visits the White House, because who knows what green policy or what social policy is now going to be used to ultimately weaponize the U.S. economy and weaponize the dollar against them.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting point, because when the United States left Afghanistan, and that's as euphemistically polite as I can be about that, we'd had diversity targets for their army, right? So we wanted the Afghan army to be X% women, and that made a lot of sense to us. We were busy enforcing that, which makes about as much sense to me in that culture as enforcing veganism on Inuits, you know?
Right.
It's just inappropriate in the constraints of that culture, but that's what we were doing. Now, probably a decade ago, I was in China. I was talking with a very high-level Chinese person whose name, has been in the news. And we were having a very frank conversation because I talk about resource issues. And I'm like, this is 10 years ago. I'm like, why does my country not understand oil and its importance to the overall underpinnings of your economy? And so the conversation went on, and I was trying to understand Belt and Road at that point in time. And he said to me, look, Chris, the business of China is business. The business of the United States is war. And what he meant by that was that's we've always had a club. That's sort of been our approach. We take the club. China takes the silk carpet out and makes people feel good. And between the two things, given a choice, the club or the carpet, it turns out a lot of people are actually liking the way China is approaching them. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be all bells, and whistles and roses going down that path, but it really feels to me like this is a tidal wave potential. That's why I said this is possibly one of the most significant events I've heard about, whether it happens or not right now, this gold-backed currency. But can you put this in the context of, well, tying it all together, everybody's favorite 100-year-old dude, centenarian, Henry Kissinger was just in China. He is the grandfather or father of the petrodollar. And we just saw China engineer a deal, a diplomatic détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing. So can you I put a lot of dots on the board for you, but they feel connected to me. Am I making too much of this?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What you said earlier about China coming in with trade and benefits for the home country, and then, the U.S. kind of dealing with war. I think that's absolutely correct. That's been the policy of China really ever since the 60s, where, the non-aligned movement, right? China was trying to create this third alternative to the US and the Soviet Union. And their deal had always been, we don't interfere in your domestic policy. Okay. We are tolerant. We respect others. You can do anything you want at home. And China's actually strengthened that now, where there was Larry Summers related a story where he met with an African diplomat who complained that when China shows up, they come with a checkbook. When the US comes, they come with a lecture, right? So China goes into these, say, African countries, just to give a specific example, Angola. So Angola's got tons of oil. A lot of it is not well exploited because they have crappy local infrastructure, so they can't ship much. So China flies in and China says, okay, here's a menu. It's almost like a lunch menu. Like, what would you like? Here's an airport. Here's highways. Here's trains. Here, housing. Which country was it? I think it was actually Angola. They built like tens of thousands of houses because Angola had ridiculously high housing costs. Anyway, they come in and offer all this stuff. Among those things is, of course, going to be a oil terminal and all of the infrastructure that you need to actually get your oil out of your country and sell it for money. All right, so China benefits because, they get this new stream of oil. Angola benefits tremendously because they get free railroads and airports. Plus, the oil was just sitting there. They weren't selling it. It wasn't doing anything. And so now they can actually sell it. Now, China's getting a friend price for sure. All right. But Angola was selling it for zero previously. So this is one heck of a deal for all these countries. And, if you line that up against the U.S., what is the U.S. bringing? I mean, if the U.S. is going to come in and lecture these countries about their union policy or social policy or, tax rates, there's this tax cartel coming out of the G20 and the OECD. That's the alternative. It's pretty tough to win with that. And final point is what happens with the American people, right? So in China's case, they're coming in and cutting these deals with countries, and the majority of the benefits are going to ultimately the Chinese people, right? So Chinese consumers get cheaper products. They get cheaper gas prices. Chinese companies become more competitive because they can get all these assets. They can, they also build the infrastructure, which is paid ultimately by the commodity sales. So everybody in China is benefiting from that whole arrangement. Now, contrast with the US, when we put great, beautiful walls around every road in Iraq, what exactly did that do for a mom and dad with 2 kids in Tulsa, right? In fact, if anything, one of them got shipped off. So, I mean, the system that we have here, I imagine that it benefits some multinational in the US somewhere without naming names. But individual Americans are absolutely savaged by our current system. So, either quit it and just let everybody live the way they like Switzerland, just have no opinion on it. Or if you're going to get involved, maybe learn from how China does it, make it in everybody's interest, meaning not just the home country, but in our people's interest.